here we go again. So a little bit about me. Not much more to add than what Michael talked about, but my career started as a software tester, as I'm certain many of you in the room, that's the case. And I spent quite a few years in that and shifted into leadership and management. I also have a programming background. So I have the technical skills and I work now with technical teams, but what I'm really most passionate about is helping teams be happier and more successful. And in every organization where I go in to do work now, they hire me because of Agile things or software quality things, but I really focus on people first, because that's where organizations are actually more successful. I'm published in a few things. I'm a training provider for the Agile Testing Fellowship with Lisa Crispin and Janet Gregory, if you know who they are. I do a lot of talks, but this is my first public talk in 4 years because of the pandemic. So I'm a little shaky and I put on my pretty shoes to help me along. So please bear with me. I also published a book, Assessing Agile Quality Practices with PPAM with Janet Gregory last year. And that is the foundation of what I'm going to talk about today. But we're going to tell a story as we go through. I am just going to add, I'm an avid hiker. I practice yoga, meditation, a number of things. And I got a chance to hike around the Portland area on the weekends in Markham Nature Park. And oh my gosh, it's beautiful. If you have not ever gone, I highly recommend it. Moving on. Now it's not working for me. Okay, no problem. There we go. So Agile values. What we intended when we shifted into Agile, and like this is not new anymore. Like this is old hat. Companies making changes into becoming Agile organizations. I mean, we're in the late adopter stage, right? And when that happens, a lot of the values underpinning any ways of working that are trying to be brought in are often lost. And that's what I see in the organizations that I work with in now. So even though there's some intended values underneath everything, it doesn't mean that that's actually what's happening. And how do we figure out what's really going on and where the problems are? So in order to tell you about that, I'm going to tell a story all the way through, and we're going to call this team Team Venus. Team Venus has 7 different people on the team. They've been Agile for about 2 years. They think they've been Agile for about 2 years because they do Scrum things and they do stand-ups and they do demos and retrospectives usually. And they use story cards or user stories or something like that in their whatever tool that they're using. And their product that they work on is an online medical supply store. So they have an external client, customer, that they're providing a store for. They do 4+ month releases. They try to do 4-month releases, but it generally hits 4 to 6 months, depending on the challenges that they're having. And the new features that they're adding are much less than what their customer would like to see. Along with that, they have a lot of problems with getting production issue patches out into the world. There's always problems going on. And they've seen a large increase in significant issues being reported by their customer over the last 6 months, which means that they have a lot of defects and a very large defect backlog that's amassed over the last couple of years. And in order to address those backlogs and address the issues, they're working a lot of overtime. The testers are doing a lot of testing at night or on weekends to get these critical things out the door. The programmers are really struggling to get things done in a healthy way to get good quality code out the door. Is any of this familiar to people in the room? That's still the case. Yeah. So the funny thing is, I remember seeing all of this 20 years ago before Agile, and it was different terminology, but the same problems were still happening. Agile was supposed to solve this, wasn't it? That's what we were told anyways. So what happened? What's really going on under the scenes? Well, I think some of us in the room, I'm hoping all of us know, Agile is not a magic bullet. There is no process that is a magic bullet to solve everything. Applying a process blindly without understanding the values underpinning it is where things go wrong. And when organizations bring in a new way of working, let's say Agile, for example, they're like, oh, we just have to do this process, this practice, that practice, and bingo, everything's working better. In a lot of organizations that I go into, what I see happen is waterfall ways of working using Agile language and practices. So how do we fix that? Well, a good friend of mine, Janet Gregory, and I kind of got together in a new way a couple years ago. We have both gone into organizations to do assessments to understand where the problems are actually in the biggest way that they need to address. And we kind of pulled together our ideas for a new client that she had at the time who wanted to kind of formalize an assessment to understand where quality was going wrong. Like in the case of Team Venus, what's actually going on? Why do we have such poor quality? Is it because the testers aren't testing enough? They're not testing the right things? Like aren't they supposed to be finding all of the problems before they have a release go out the door? Like, this is Agile ways of working. Why are we asking those questions still? So we pulled together to create a new framework, which isn't really new, but it's just a way to kind of simplify and understand things. Because quality is paramount. If we don't have quality, we don't have value for our customers. Just because you get something out the door in the terms of new features, let's say, if there's no quality associated with that, we don't have value for our customers. They're not going to value it. They're going to be frustrated. They're not going to want to use it, right? A good mentor of mine who passed away a few years ago, Jerry Weinberg, says quality is some value to some person, which alongside is without quality, there is no value. So this tool that we developed, we call it Quality Practices Assessment Model. I was talking with another of the keynote speakers, Carl, last night, and he said, we don't need new models. And frankly, I agree, but we happened to put together a framework. We called it a model, and I'm going to take you through a story with Team Venus alongside that. Basically, it's a way for teams to reflect on and assess the quality of their practices and processes to understand where quality is breaking down in the organization. Is it really about testing? It could be, but often there's more to it than that. So with this framework, this model, we identified 10 quality aspects. These are the 10 that stood out to us in the work that we were doing. And we surveyed a lot of our colleagues in the industry as well. We also got their input about which ones were most important to address quality and improve quality in organizations. And we started with feedback loops. Feedback loops seem to be the biggest importance in organizations where if we get feedback loops working really well, quality goes up. If you start with defect management, you may see improvements, but it's a Band-Aid solution if you don't get the foundation working right. So these are the 10 quality aspects, and I'm going to take you through them in segments. So first, the social quality aspects. Feedback loops are things like how the team communicates with each other. It could include things like unit tests, but it's often about how are we communicating with one another? Is it early and often, or do we just kind of throw things over the wall? How are we communicate with management and leadership, and how are they communicating with us? How do we communicate with our customers? One of the tenets of Agile ways of working is that we have short, frequent feedback loops. If that is not working well, then we're missing the opportunity to pivot and improve in an Agile way to ensure that we have a good understanding of what it is that our customers want and that we do that in a quality way. Second is culture. If our culture is a mess, if people don't feel safe to speak up, if they don't feel safe to speak with one another, if they're working lots of overtime, if they are focusing on quality being demanded by their leadership or management, they have like quality directives, but they don't know how to implement them. And the team is not responsible or accountable for putting those ideas around quality in place and we have problems. The culture and the feedback loops. When I go into organizations, when Janet goes in, and a lot of our colleagues do, when we're doing this well, we start with these areas first. This is what makes a big difference. And then from there, it's learning and improvement. Do people have the opportunity to learn and grow on the job, or do they have to leave that aside outside of their working hours? Are they invited to and encouraged to go to conferences, training? But do they also share with each other back at work? Do you do things like book clubs or do workshops with one another? As a team member to other team members, do we do pairing situations? Do we do retrospectives in a healthy, interesting way rather than doing the rote same retrospective every single 2 weeks? So all of those things make a really big difference. So if we look at Team Venus, revisiting them, I'm not going to read everything on the slides. The slides will be available for you later. But if you were to look deeper, this is what you would see going on in this team. They work with some structure. They use some Scrum. They sometimes discuss their user stories with customers and management, but usually their product owner just gives them the stories and they make an assumption, an interpretation about what that means. The programmers go off and code, the testers go off and develop their tests, and there's a little bit of interaction and collaboration, but mostly they're doing their own thing. The team members do stand-ups, they do demos, they do retrospectives, sometimes monthly. They have some of the practices in place or the structure in place, but they're not really getting the value out of that. For example, if they're at a stand-up, everyone reports the status about what they've been working on, what they're doing. That is the way stand-ups, we were told how to do them, right? But are they actually adding value? Do I need to know what you did yesterday and what you're doing today if that doesn't contribute to how are we getting this work done together this week or today? Shouldn't we be using it as a planning session? That is where shifts like that happen. So Team Venus, they're not using things like that in that way. That's part of the issues that are going on. They're missing opportunities for communication, connection, and understanding. Same with the culture. Management sets their quality directives. The team members are regularly working overtime, which in fact causes more issues. They have more defects. They miss more things because everyone's tired and they're burning out. And people do not feel safe to speak to management about problems. Learning and improvement. Team members are usually able to attend a training or a conference, which is amazing. They do retrospectives and they sometimes do some root cause analysis. So some things are going okay. Some things are not going okay. Let's move on to the social and technical combined aspects. These two are development approach and quality and test ownership. So development approach is about how is our team made up? Do we have all the right roles in the team? Do we have a shared quality mindset? Or is it the testers are responsible for quality? Or is it a whole team understanding and the whole team's not just buying into it, but a whole team's participating in quality and testing? What practices do we have? How do we understand and prioritize features and stories? Definition of done, how do we release to production? So it's the end-to-end development approach for the entire team. And then for quality and test ownership, we're looking at how do we understand quality? Do we create and execute tests together? Do we have a holistic model for and strategy for forming that? And is it owned by the whole team or is it not? So with looking at those two, for revisiting Team Venus, their development approach it's okay, but it's not awesome. It's not great. There's a lack of good communication, early collaboration. The programmers are deciding what a story means and goes off and codes. They're not working together to understand and design and strategize. Team members are often working in their roles in silos. Testing's often happening after coding. It's not usually happening alongside. And so the testers are having to work overtime to get the testing done in time for their iteration end date or the release date. And production releases are happening every 4 to 6 months, but they're trying to get them down to every quarter. And they're struggling with that because of all the problems that they're having. With quality and test ownership, the team is discussing how to achieve quality directives together. So it's interesting because some of their development approach is really not working well, but there is a little bit of movement forwards in we share and own quality together. The programmers are sometimes creating unit tests, but sometimes they don't because they're pressured and they're running out of time. Team members are discussing functional tests and how best to create them. And sometimes the programmers are stepping in to automate some of those. So those are some positive things that are happening. But the earlier things, we go back to the earlier quality aspects like feedback loops, communication, early collaboration and understanding, those things are lacking. So just because we have some later things working well, if we're missing the earlier things, that's where our foundation is broken. And finally, moving into the technical aspects. So there's 5 aspects here. Testing breadth. So things like our test strategy, test techniques, what models are we using? Like there's a test automation pyramid, 4 quadrants, things like that. User acceptance testing. And then code quality and technical debt includes things like unit testing, our standards, code maintenance. From there, we look at test automation and tools, automating functional tests, quality attribute tests, unit tests, et cetera. And then deployment pipeline. So what things are we using for automation and testing and infrastructure? Continuous integration, continuous deployments. Do we have things like observability and moderating in place? Our release strategy, all of those things fall in that buckets. And our defect management, reporting, fixing, metrics, et cetera. So one of the interesting things that I've noticed and some of my colleagues have noticed is that most organizations are focusing on things like test automation and tools first. Anyone else seen that? Is that working? I see heads shaking. Yeah, it focuses on the bottom at the technical things, but if we don't have the social and the understanding and collaboration, communication things working well, then we are likely working on the wrong things at the wrong time. And we want to turn that around. So if we revisit back to Team Venus, they're testing breadth. They're actually doing decent in that area. The whole team is discussing a test strategy up front. It doesn't mean that it's the right strategy, but they're at least discussing it. The testers are still responsible for it. The team is employing different test techniques, though. They're using things like heuristics. They're using things like quality attributes. And they're using things like the 4 testing quadrants and the automation test pyramid to guide and inform their test strategy. And they're having those discussions as a team. And that's really amazing. That's not often seen in a team that is struggling in all the other ways that they're struggling, like in Team Venus. And with code quality and technical debt, they do have some coding standards, but they are struggling with a large backlog of technical debt, including things like a lot of missing unit tests and other issues. They do have code quality and analysis tools to identify gaps, but a lot of those gaps just get put into their backlog. So they are just struggling in that area. With test automation and tools, they automate new feature functional tests. They have a small set of unit tests, and they are adding to them with new features usually, and with some of the bug fixes and patches that they're doing usually. But again, when they're pressured, which they often are at this point in time, some of those things get kind of pushed aside because they can come back to it later. And later often does not come because they're so busy trying to catch up all the time. And their deployment pipeline, they're starting towards continuous integration, but they often have problems with test environments, which delays the tester's ability to do testing. And automated tests are starting to use some version control, though. So they're starting to put those into the code repository too, so they don't live outside of that in a separate tool. Those are good things too. Defect management. They're trying to shift to defect prevention, so we stop putting the defects in to begin with. We have a large defect backlog, but we have large and frequent defect triage meetings because there's so many defects to address. So Team Venus, how are they doing? Shaky? Good? Shaky. Yeah. And this, like Team Venus, this is a pretty standard example of what I see in a lot of organizations still. Maybe I'm being brought into the wrong organizations, the ones maybe that's probably why I have worked there, but they're really struggling with the core. They just want to jump in and go fast, fast, fast on Agile, and Agile's going to solve all these problems and we can just automate everything. And they forget to stop and go back to the values. We look at getting their values in place, which is going up the ladder into the social aspects first. That's where everything can get solved. And it'll just go down the list from there, much easier. So those are the 10 quality aspects. We're going to come back to Team Venus in a little bit. First, I'm going to go into the 4 dimensions. So we looked at these 10 quality aspects, and within those 10 quality aspects, I identified and shared a lot of the practices within those. So there's a lot of practices that you can assess. And we looked at 4 different dimensions. So beginning, unifying, practicing, and innovating. And this sounds a lot like a maturity model, right? But it's not a maturity model. And Janet and I are really clear about that because we don't like maturity models. There's an assumption that you have to get all the way to the right-hand side into the innovating category. And that's not true. And that's not necessarily the best choice for every team or organization. So it's really important that we consider the context of the people involved, their current environment, where they want to go, what is a good fit for them at this time and in the future, and to choose right for their context. For some teams, a particular practice, they might land in unifying and be totally fine with that, and that's okay. What we use this, the QPAM model, the Quality Practices Assessment Model, what we use it for is to help understand the landscape for where a team and organization is at right now and identify their opportunities for where do they want to go. It's like a map. We want to know where we are so we can plan for how we're going to get to where we want to be. So looking at these dimensions, the beginning, we have little structure, few processes. We often work in silos. There's low quality code, a lot of defects, little to no automation, may feel like chaos. Interestingly, for some of the later adopters into Agile, even though they've been working in an Agile way for 2 or 3 years, for some of the teams that I've worked with, they're absolutely still in the beginning dimension across the board or in a lot of their quality aspects. And it's because they focused on the fastness that they were told Agile would be for them. We just go fast and cram a lot of things in. We can just keep go, right? And that's not true. We know that in order to go faster, you really have to slow down and get your foundation right. And then the speed comes later. So teams can be in beginning for 6 months. They could be there for 3 years. Like there's no time frame associated with that. And it really comes down to values. And one of the things that I talk about with teams is like, let's look at the values for this way of working that you're adopting. Let's look at your team values. Are they a match? Do you want them to be a match? And if not, let's choose a different approach that's aligned with your values, right? Rather than trying to force an approach to match your values when it just is not going to happen. Unifying dimension. So maybe we've adopted 1 or more Agile methods like Scrum or Kanban. There's a lot of choices. Let's hope that it's not a choice that looks a lot like a really, really heavy, bigger than waterfall process. Cross-functional teams, they learn to work in smaller chunks. They're starting to release more often, and test automation is stressed, but it's not a blind tool. Like it's not going to be a magic bullet, and they recognize that. So they're just coming together. And this is where teams, you see there's more engagement and collaboration. There's a little bit more of a buzz, even if they're all remote work. If I'm in a live virtual meeting with that team, there's interaction and discussion across the board. You don't have people just quietly checking out and not engaging because they happen to be in an online stand-up and they don't have to participate. So you see a change in the energy with the teams there. In the practicing dimension, practices are starting to feel natural. And there's a real buzz and a flow with teams in the practicing dimension. They're consistently delivering value to customers. They are really using their feedback loops really well. And they're thinking about testing holistically. Quality and flow are really important to them, and they focus and prioritize that above all else. And that's where teams who are in the beginning dimension may look at a team in the practicing dimension and think, oh my gosh, they're going so slowly. But they're not going slowly. They're actually taking time to get things right, which is speeding them up in the end. And then the innovating dimension, this is our really high-performing teams. They have really short cycle times. They're really self-disciplined. They're really focused on learning and improving. They use a lot of monitoring and observability metrics and data. And they just build in quality from the start. Has anyone worked in a team, like in an innovating dimension team? See one hand, a few hands. Yeah, there are far and few between. It really takes a lot of discipline and practice to get there, and a lot of intentionality and mindfulness. And I'd say over my, I know more than 15 years in Agile teams, I would say maybe 5 to 8 teams out of a lot, like maybe 5% of the teams I've worked with. And it just takes a lot of time. And one of the things that I see happen in organizations often, like, let's say there's an Agile maturity assessment model. One of the organizations, actually many that I've worked in, have Agile maturity assessment models in place, and they have to do assessments and see where the maturity is. And a lot of teams keep placing themselves in world-class, we're world-class. And like, oh my gosh, you don't even know, you're still in the beginning domain. Like, you just don't even know what you don't know yet, right? And the teams who are in innovating dimension, like, they know what they don't know. They really take time to understand what's out there and what they need to learn still, and they love that opportunity. And they slow down in order to take that opportunity. So bringing it all together, we have 4 dimensions. We have 10 quality aspects. And there's a way to look at that in a chart, a table, a matrix, that's the right word, in a matrix to see what they may look like across the board. I'll flash that up briefly before I stop today. But before we get there, so facilitating an assessment, it could be that a team may choose to self-assess themselves across the board, or they may look at a specific quality aspect in those practices. It could be that you have someone internal in the organization to facilitate the assessment on behalf of that team and to work with them. Or it could be that you bring in an external consultant to facilitate that assessment for you and to provide recommendations and where to go next. Regardless of how it is approached, you can use things like process retrospectives, interviews, looking at artifacts, and just general daily observation to understand what's going on. You want to take time to prepare the questions that you're going to ask of them in the process retrospective or in interviews, whether they're one-on-one or as, groups of people, as a team or as product owners or as programmers, like whatever groups are helpful to do that interviewing process with. And you really just want to spend time listening. The key here, though, is that there's safety for everybody involved, that people don't feel like their jobs are in jeopardy in any way, that they feel safe to open up, and that what they share with you as a facilitator, they know that that is kept, say, anonymous, basically, if they need it to be kept anonymous, but it can go into the collective report, right, without naming names. It depends on where a team is at in their progression to understand what's important for them to share publicly and not. And it can be formal or informal. The whole thing is a spectrum, and you're welcome to do whatever is the right fit for you. In our model and in the book, we have a very detailed, comprehensive list of questions to ask at each stage for each quality aspect. And for each of the quality practices, these are all types of questions that we use, but I'm sure that there are questions that you could think to ask that we did not write down. Like, we just want to seed ideas for teams, for individuals, so that you have something that you can go to and use without having to reinvent the wheel, basically. We want to make it easy and accessible for everybody. So these are examples of some of the questions that we might ask, just one, but there's about, in some cases, like 15 questions in each area, at least, that we provided. And then putting it all together, you would consolidate the information, set some clear expectations about, what you're going in with and what's going to come out the other side, how you're going to work together. And regardless of whether it's an internal assessment or an external, you want to just make sure that there's an opportunity to document your observations, what you've learned, what you've discovered, and what are the areas to undertake for improvement. So the team might say, okay, we're really struggling with feedback loops and development approach. So we want to take some time to focus on improving in those two areas. And we're going to identify an experiment to try and see what we think could come out the other side, and take that with us and see how that helps us with improvements. If you're an external facilitator, you might have really clear recommendations and steps that they can take offered to the organization and to the team. So one way to present the information, other than a document or a table, is to use something like a radar chart. And I really like this because it's like a map. It provides a map, an opportunity to look at where are we now and where do we want to go? So for Team Venus, who I described all along the way, this is what their radar chart would look like based on what's identified in the story today. So culture, automation and tools, so test automation and tools, development approach, they're really in the beginning stage. They're really struggling to get going and off the grounds. And testing breadth, though, they're doing pretty well in that area they're practicing. And because that's going well enough, they don't need to focus any energy on improving that right now. And then all of the other areas we would put in the unifying area, the test ownership, learning, code quality, defect management, feedback, pipeline. They're not in horrible shape, but the ones that are in beginning, culture, test automation tools, development approach, that is where their quality issues are really rooted in. This is what this assessment model can help you with, is understand exactly where do we need to focus first to adjust, because it'd be really easy to say, no, we just need to add more testing. We need to add more test automation. Well, that is true in part with this example with Team Venus, but what if we get the culture and development approach sorted out too? Like, what are the biggest areas to address there? And which practices specifically we would want to go into the practices to look at those two. So for example, for testing breadth, the one that they're doing really well in, if we looked at mapping this according to how they're doing in each practice, this is what that would look like. You could do the same for any of the quality aspects to look deeper. So it's just a way to frame and understand where are we now and where are we going to get the biggest bang for our buck to improve next. So we're not making assumptions about what do we need to focus on improving. We're choosing strategically based on what we have discovered about ourselves. So for Team Venus, goals that they might have is to make communication, collaboration, and a high quality work ethic standard. That's just how we operate. So how can we get there? They would talk about and identify some experiments to try. How do we want to improve collaboration, communication? Which things are going to give us the biggest bang for the buck? Reducing defects. We want to have that as a goal, but how can we get there? And all of the other things there. And even then, like the team would say, well, we really want to enjoy our work together. We want to have fun. We want to enjoy value-adding activities. We think spending half of our time on defect and issues is not fun. So how do we turn that around? So some of the possible choices that they might make are listed here. So focusing in on feedback loops, what are some specific things that we might try? development approach and code quality similarly. So we would recommend, like as a team member or as a consultant, facilitator, whomever, we would recommend pick one experiment to try to focus on in each area. And once that's going well, then pick the next thing. Like don't tackle everything at once. It's not helpful. And even within these quality aspect areas, prioritize which one are you focusing on now. It's like your product backlog, you got to prioritize it. Prioritize does not mean we do everything at the same time. You do one thing at a time, right? So we do the same thing with our improvement activities, and we create a plan and we build it into our plan for our iterations or whatever cycle of work that you're calling it or using it as, so that we can be successful. So kind of summarizing all of this, I'm not going to read it all through, but it's available for you to read later, looking at what the differences are for each quality aspect across the dimensions, what they might look like. It's much more in detail in our book. And the book comes with an accompanying spreadsheet that gives you a summary of everything and creating radar aspects. And it's just a free tool that you can use to help you. It's funny because when we created this, it was specifically to solve a problem for a particular client. And I helped Janet along with that, and then she completed it, and we're like, we have something here. Like, what do we want to do with this? And we thought about a lot of things, and we said, the easiest thing to do, let's write a book about it, put it in the world. It's easy, it's accessible for everybody, and it's not ours. You can take it and do what you want with it. And we hope that you will. We've had a lot of really good feedback from people who've been applying it and using it. And that it's just simplifying things for teams to understand what do we need to focus on first so that our quality does improve. So some benefits here. There's a consistent message for teams that is not method specific. So it's intended for Agile teams, but you don't have to be an Agile team to use this or benefit from this. Teams will know where they are and can decide on where you want to improve. This is where we amplify. We amplify our Agile quality practices. If we don't know where we are, we can't figure out where we're going to go next. Just remember, it's not a maturity model. Not all teams are needing to be in the innovative dimension. It's not appropriate for every team, and that's totally okay. So there's no judgment about that. So what's next? So we wrote the first book, Assessing Agile Quality Practices. We released it on LeanPub last year. That is coming on to Amazon in November. And we've also written a facilitator's guide for assessments that will be released in November. It's agnostic to any assessment model, but it includes examples from QPAM and in-depth case studies for 4 different teams. So we're really proud about that. I did have some brochures go around. If you wanted more information about it, like, no worries. If not, if you're like, whatever, moving on, I'm going to go to the next thing, no problem. But if you're interested in that, the Scan Me will take you to the book link if you're interested in that. And yeah, I guess we have a little time for questions. Otherwise, I also have stickers. If you like this QPAM image and you want a circle sticker, I'm happy to give those out, okay? This is the first time I publicly talked about this. Janet has done a few talks on it. Janet and Lisa Crispin, if you know her, they've also done some workshops on it. I've just been kind of hunkered down in my home with my cat for a while. So thank you so much for the opportunity to share this with you. And I hope that it's added value and that you can take something really practical away and back to work that you can apply. And remember, start with the social aspects first. Thank you so much.